900 years ago, the largest city in North America was not in Mexico, and it was not built by anyone Europeans ever met. It stood on the banks of the Mississippi River, home to more people than London at the exact same moment in history. It had pyramids taller than a 10-story building, a solar calendar built from wood, and a name we will never actually know, because the people who built it left without saying why, and by the time anyone thought to ask, they were already gone. This is Cahokia. Today it's a quiet stretch of grassy mounds just across the river from St. Louis, Illinois, visited by a fraction of the tourists who flock to Rome or Giza every year. Most Americans have never heard of it. Most Americans have no idea that 1,000 years ago, this patch of Midwestern floodplain held a city larger, more organized, and more architecturally ambitious than most European capitals of its time. At its peak, somewhere between 1050 and 1200 CE, Cahokia held an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 people within its urban core, with tens of thousands more in the surrounding farmland that fed it. For comparison, no city in what would become the United States would match that population again until Philadelphia, in the late 1700s, nearly 600 years later. This was, for a very long time, the biggest thing humans had ever built north of Mexico. And then, within a couple of centuries, it was empty. Not destroyed, not conquered, just emptied gradually until nothing was left but earth and silence. This is the story of how a city that size rose out of nothing in less than a century, what it actually built while it was here, and the unresolved argument over why its people eventually chose to walk away from all of it. Let's start with the scale, because numbers alone can make Cahokia sound abstract, and it wasn't. It was physical, and it was enormous. Around 600 CE, native communities began settling in what archaeologists call the American Bottom, the fertile floodplain formed where the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers converge. For centuries, this was unremarkable farmland, home to modest agricultural communities like countless others across the region. Then, sometime around 1050 CE, something changed. Within a span of decades, not centuries, the population in this one location exploded. Researchers still don't fully agree on why the growth happened so fast, but the result is not in dispute. By 1100 CE, Cahokia had become the largest urban settlement north of the Aztec and Maya cities of Mesoamerica, sprawling across an estimated 6 square miles and organized around at least 120 constructed earthen mounds. The centerpiece of all of it was a single structure, now called Monk's Mound, named centuries later for a group of Trappist monks who briefly lived nearby, with no connection to the people who actually built it. Monk's Mound rises roughly 100 feet into the air across 4 distinct terraces and covers close to 15 acres at its base, meaning its footprint is actually larger than the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza, even though it doesn't reach the same height. It stands as the largest prehistoric earthwork anywhere in the Americas. And it wasn't just piled up randomly. Excavations have shown the mound was built in deliberate engineered layers, sometimes using different soil types specifically chosen for stability and drainage, constructed in phases over roughly 2 centuries as the city itself grew. A structure like that on its own would already make Cahokia remarkable. But the mound wasn't just a monument. Researchers believe a large building, likely the residence or ceremonial seat of the city's ruling elite, once stood on its flattened summit, positioned to look out over the entire city below, a deliberate display of power written directly into the landscape, visible from every corner of the settlement. Around Monk's Mound, the city was organized with genuine urban planning. A central plaza spanning roughly 50 acres sat at the heart of Cahokia, large enough, by some estimates, to hold more than 40 football fields side by side. This wasn't empty ceremonial space. It was where thousands of people would have gathered for games, festivals, trade, and civic life, the functional and symbolic center of an entire metropolitan region. A wooden palisade wall, built from thousands of individual log posts and later rebuilt multiple times over the city's history, enclosed the ceremonial core, suggesting the ruling class took the defense, or at least the visual separation of this central district, seriously enough to invest enormous ongoing labor into maintaining it. And Cahokia wasn't isolated. Archaeological finds recovered from the site include copper originating from the Great Lakes region, seashells from the Gulf of Mexico coast, and mica sourced from the Appalachian Mountains, hundreds of miles away in every direction. This was a city plugged into a trade network that stretched across a huge portion of the North American continent, pulling in raw materials and, almost certainly, ideas, techniques, and people from an enormous catchment area. Whoever ran Cahokia wasn't managing a large farming village. They were managing the hub of a continental trade and political network, coordinating labor, resources, and authority at a scale nothing else in the region came close to matching. The agricultural foundation making all of this possible deserves its own attention because a city this size does not sustain itself by accident. Cahokia's farmers cultivated maize as their primary staple crop, supplemented by squash, beans, and a range of native plants across the rich floodplain surrounding the urban core. Archaeobotanists studying preserved plant remains and pollen samples from the site have documented sustained experimentation with different crop varieties and cultivation techniques, suggesting Cahokia's farmers were actively refining their methods to maximize yield for an urban population that, by some estimates, required feeding tens of thousands of additional people beyond those actually living within the city's dense core. This wasn't subsistence farming supporting scattered villages. This was surplus-generating agriculture organized at a scale necessary to sustain genuine urban density, freeing a portion of the population to specialize in construction, craft production, trade, religious administration, and the kind of large-scale civic labor a city like this demanded. The wooden palisade wall surrounding the ceremonial core adds another layer to the picture. Excavations have shown the wall was rebuilt multiple times over the city's roughly 2-century peak, each iteration requiring thousands of individual log posts set close enough together to form a genuine barrier, complete with bastions, positioned at intervals allowing defenders to cover the wall's exterior face. The scale of labor required to build and repeatedly rebuild a structure like this suggests Cahokia's rulers took the physical security, or at minimum the symbolic separation, of the city's core seriously enough to invest enormous ongoing resources into maintaining it throughout the settlement's history, even as the wall would have restricted casual movement between the ceremonial district and the surrounding residential neighborhoods. Now here's where Cahokia stops looking merely impressive and starts looking genuinely startling. In the 1960s, archaeologists excavating an area just west of Monk's Mound uncovered a series of massive circular arrangements of wooden posts, now known as Woodhenge. The largest of these circles measured roughly 410 feet in diameter, built from tall, thick red cedar trunks set upright into the ground at carefully measured intervals. At first, the purpose of these posts wasn't obvious, but researchers eventually noticed something remarkable. Specific posts within the circle aligned precisely with the position of the sunrise on the summer and winter solstices, and on the spring and fall equinoxes. Standing at the center of the circle on the correct morning, an observer would watch the sun rise directly behind a specific marker post, functioning as an extraordinarily precise solar calendar, built entirely from wood, requiring detailed, sustained astronomical observation to construct correctly. Think about what that combination actually represents. This is a society capable of moving 20 million basket loads of earth by hand, organizing a 50-acre civic plaza, running trade routes stretching 1,000 miles in every direction, and simultaneously tracking the precise motion of the sun across an entire year, accurately enough to construct a functioning astronomical instrument out of tree trunks. A farming village doesn't need that level of technical sophistication. A society doesn't build something like Woodhenge unless timekeeping, likely tied to agricultural planning and religious ceremony, mattered enormously to how the entire civilization operated. And then there's Mound 72, which reveals a darker, more complicated side of Cahokia's story. Excavated in the 1960s, Mound 72 is a smaller earthwork located south of the main ceremonial core, and what archaeologists found inside it forced a significant rethinking of how centralized and hierarchical Cahokian society actually was. At the center of the mound, excavators discovered the remains of a man laid out on a platform made from roughly 20,000 shell beads, arranged deliberately in the shape of a large bird, possibly meant to represent a falcon, a symbol connected to warfare and elite status in later Mississippian iconography. Buried nearby were the remains of hundreds of other individuals, many showing clear evidence of ritual sacrifice. In one section of the mound, archaeologists found 53 young women, most between 18 and 23 years old, buried together, apparently executed and interred simultaneously as part of a single event. In another area, the remains of 39 men and women showed signs of having been executed on the spot, seemingly lined up at the edge of a prepared pit before being killed in sequence. This is not the archaeological signature of a loosely organized farming community. This is the signature of a society with a powerful, centralized ruling class, capable of commanding not just enormous labor for construction projects, but life and death authority over its own population, expressed through large-scale ritual sacrifice tied directly to the city's political and religious structure. Beyond the mounds and the ritual burials, everyday life in Cahokia was rich in ways that rarely make it into the popular imagination of pre-Columbian America. Archaeologists have recovered enormous quantities of a distinctive polished stone disc used in a game called Chunky, which appears to have been wildly popular throughout the Mississippian world and likely originated at or near Cahokia itself. Later, historical accounts from the 18th and 19th centuries, recorded after European contact with descendant cultures, describe the game being played by rolling a carefully shaped stone disc across a prepared playing field while participants ran alongside it, hurling long wooden poles in an attempt to land them as close as possible to wherever the disc eventually stopped. Points were awarded based on proximity, and historical accounts describe heavy gambling on the outcome, with players and spectators wagering tools, clothing, and other valuable possessions on a single roll. Archaeologist Timothy Pocketat, who has written extensively on Cahokia, has described the likely scene in the city's Grand Plaza during major chunky events as electric, with a ruler positioned atop Monk's Mound raising his arms to signal the start of play, while a crowd of 1,000 or more gathered below. The sound of the disc rolling across packed earth met with a roar from the assembled spectators. Excavations have also recovered evidence of a caffeinated ceremonial drink, made from the roasted leaves of a holly plant native to the region, consumed in specialized pottery vessels found throughout elite areas of the site. Chemical residue analysis on fragments of this pottery has confirmed the presence of caffeine compounds, indicating this was a ritually significant beverage, likely consumed during ceremonies, possibly linked to purification rites, described in much later historical accounts from related Southeastern cultures, who continued similar practices well into the era of European contact. All of this, taken together, paints a picture of Cahokia as a genuinely complete urban civilization. Monumental architecture, precise astronomical engineering, long-distance trade, competitive sport and gambling culture, ritual beverages, and a centralized political and religious hierarchy backed by the demonstrated willingness to carry out mass sacrifice. It is, by any reasonable definition, a city in the fullest sense of the word, built entirely without the wheel, without draft animals, and without a written language to record any of it in its builder's own words. So who were these people, and what happened to make them build all of this in the first place? Cahokia was constructed by people belonging to what archaeologists call the Mississippian culture, a broad tradition of mound-building, maize-farming societies that spread across much of the American Southeast and Midwest between roughly 800 and 1600 CE. Cahokia itself represents the largest, most architecturally ambitious expression of that tradition anywhere on the continent. But it was not unique in kind, it was unique in scale. Related, smaller mound centers existed throughout the Mississippian world, connected to Cahokia through trade, shared religious iconography, and likely political alliance or influence, similar in concept to how Great Zimbabwe sat at the center of a broader network of related stone-walled cities in southern Africa. The name Cahokia itself is not the name its builders used. By the time European explorers eventually reached the region, the original inhabitants were long gone, and a different indigenous group, the Cahokia tribe, who were living in the area but were not descended from the mound builders, gave their name to the site simply because they happened to be nearby when French explorers arrived centuries later. The true name of the city, the language its rulers spoke, and the specific identity of its ruling elite are, at this point, permanently lost. Everything we know comes from the earth itself. The mounds, the burials, the trade goods, and the alignment of the posts. Now, let's talk about the disappearance, because this is the part of Cahokia's story that remains genuinely unresolved. Cahokia's population began declining noticeably after around 1200 CE, and the city was largely abandoned by approximately 1350, less than 200 years after reaching its peak. That's a strikingly short lifespan for a settlement this ambitious, this organized, and this architecturally significant. Something pushed tens of thousands of people to walk away from a city their ancestors had built with millions of hours of collective labor, and archaeologists still argue over exactly what combination of factors was responsible. Climate appears to be part of the answer. Cahokia's rise happened during the medieval climate optimum, a period of relatively warm, stable weather across much of the world between roughly 900 and 1200 CE, conditions that would have strongly favored the intensive maize agriculture Cahokia's enormous population depended on. But the record shows a major Mississippi River flood around 1150 CE, followed by extended droughts affecting the region through the 1200s, right as the climate began shifting toward the cooler, less stable conditions of what's known as the Little Ice Age. A population this large, this concentrated, and this dependent on consistent agricultural surplus would have been extremely vulnerable to exactly this kind of environmental disruption. Environmental strain caused by the city's own success compounds the problem. Supporting 15 to 20,000 people concentrated in one location for 2 centuries would have required enormous quantities of timber for construction, fuel, and palisade walls, alongside cleared agricultural land to feed the population. Some researchers argue this level of sustained resource extraction gradually degraded the surrounding landscape, causing soil erosion and reduced agricultural productivity precisely as climate conditions were also turning against them, creating a compounding crisis rather than a single dramatic event. There's also a political dimension worth considering. A society organized around this level of centralized authority, one demonstrably willing to carry out mass ritual sacrifice to reinforce that authority, may have been vulnerable to internal instability once environmental pressures began straining the system that legitimized the ruling elite's power in the first place. If the rulers of Cahokia derived their authority partly from claims about ensuring agricultural abundance and cosmic order, sustained drought and crop, failure would have directly undermined the ideological foundation the entire political structure rested on. What we know for certain is this: there is no evidence of violent conquest, no mass grave suggesting the city was destroyed by an enemy, no single catastrophic event marking Cahokia's end. The decline was gradual, stretched across a century or more as people dispersed outward into smaller settlements throughout the region rather than vanishing entirely. The descendants of Cahokia's population did not disappear from history. They scattered, carrying elements of Mississippian culture, religious iconography, and mound-building tradition into the smaller communities that eventually became the historic native nations European colonizers would later encounter across the American Southeast and Midwest. It's worth placing this decline in a wider comparative context, because Cahokia was far from the only Mississippian mound center, and its trajectory mirrors, in miniature, a pattern seen at related sites throughout the region. Smaller mound complexes at locations across the southeast, some clearly influenced by or connected to Cahokia through shared iconography and trade, experienced their own periods of growth and eventual decline during roughly overlapping centuries, suggesting the pressures acting on Cahokia, whether climatic, agricultural, or political, were not unique to one location, but reflected broader vulnerabilities running through the entire Mississippian cultural system. Some of these related centers persisted for centuries after Cahokia's own decline, continuing mound-building traditions and complex political organization right up until European contact disrupted native societies across the continent through disease, displacement, and conquest, beginning in the 1500s and 1600s. This raises a genuinely interesting possibility that some researchers have proposed. Rather than Cahokia representing a singular civilization that simply failed, it may be more accurate to understand it as the largest and most concentrated expression of a much longer-running Mississippian urban tradition, one that continued adapting, relocating, and reorganizing itself in different forms across the Southeast for centuries, both before and after Cahokia's specific rise and fall. Under this framing, Cahokia's story isn't really an ending. It's the most dramatic chapter in a much longer, more distributed story of indigenous urban civilization in North America, one that mainstream historical narratives have historically underrepresented, in part because its monuments were built from earth rather than stone and eroded, grassed over, and were misunderstood by early European settlers who sometimes assumed, incorrectly and for reasons rooted in the same colonial-era biases that plagued early interpretations of Great Zimbabwe, that native peoples could not have engineered something this sophisticated without outside influence. That comparison matters. Just as European colonial authorities once insisted Great Zimbabwe's stone walls must have been built by Phoenicians or some other outside civilization, rather than accept African ingenuity, early American archaeology in the 19th century entertained similarly unfounded theories about Cahokia and other mound sites, sometimes attributing them to a supposed vanished mound builder race, distinct from and superior to the native peoples European settlers were actively displacing at the time. It took decades of careful, evidence-based archaeology to fully dismantle that narrative and correctly credit Cahokia's construction to the ancestors of the very indigenous nations whose displacement colonial mythology had been used to justify. So here's where the honest picture of Cahokia actually lands, once you set aside easy explanations. This wasn't a primitive settlement that simply failed. This was the largest, most sophisticated city built anywhere in North America before European contact, larger than London at the same moment in history, capable of monumental earthwork construction on a scale unmatched anywhere on the continent, precise enough in its astronomical knowledge to build a functioning solar calendar, and centralized enough in its political structure to carry out large-scale ritual sacrifice. And within 2 centuries of reaching that peak, its own success, combined with a shifting climate it could not control, appears to have made the entire system unsustainable. The uncomfortable question that remains genuinely open is how much of Cahokia's collapse was environmental bad luck, arriving at the worst possible moment for a city already straining under its own resource demands, and how much was a deeper structural fragility built into a society this centralized, this dependent on a small ruling class whose authority rested on claims about controlling forces, climate, harvest, cosmic order, that ultimately proved to be beyond anyone's control at all. We may never fully separate those threads, because the people who could have explained it in their own words left no writing behind, only earth, bone, and the precise angle of a few wooden posts pointed at a sunrise 900 years gone. What's left today is quiet, grassy mounds, a reconstructed section of Woodhenge, a visitor center a fraction of the size of what you'd expect for a UNESCO World Heritage Site holding this much history, Most people driving past on the interstate near St. Louis have no idea that the largest city in pre-Columbian North America, once bigger than London, sits just off the highway, mostly empty, mostly forgotten. So we want to ask you directly, do you think Cahokia's people left because the land failed them, because their own political system collapsed under pressure, or some combination neither factor alone can fully explain? Leave your theory in the comments below. We read every one of them. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the kind hiding in plain sight, closer than you'd expect, and still not fully explained, make sure you're subscribed, because next time we're heading somewhere just as remarkable. Until then, stay curious and keep questioning the version of history you were handed.